Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald, and this is Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Good to have you both here. It's Wednesday, the 12th of February. Thank you so much for being with us on Holyrood Sources. On the podcast today, your questions answered and your thoughts discussed. It's taken us ages to get to them. Sorry. But today we're devoting actual time to your WhatsApps and your voice notes, your emails, etc. All of that to come. Just want to do a few minutes, though, to start off with on Anas Sarwar announcing yesterday that a Labour administration would retain many of the things that are currently free in Scotland. So, free prescriptions, the Scottish Child Payment, the baby box, universal free school lunches, all of these sorts of things. Your thoughts on that very welcome as we get into the discussion. You can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507. And next week's episode is with Anas Sarwar and Jackie Baillie, the leader and deputy leader of Scottish Labour. We've actually already had a bunch of questions in from Angus, from Duncan, from Andrew, from Craig, and from more other people as well. So email us before next Monday if you've got a question for the leader and deputy leader of Scottish Labour. The email address is hello@holyroodsources.com. Find us on YouTube, find us on X, find us on TikTok, and subscribe to the mailing list at holyroodsources.com. Right, Anas Sarwar then, pledging to keep free tuition fees and prescriptions if he becomes the next First Minister. He has confirmed a list of policies that are currently in existence would be brought forward at Holyrood, and he would retain them, if he forms the next Scottish Government next year. But he's warned the policies alone aren't enough as an offer to the public. He says there's a need to do much more to improve outcomes for Scots. Andy, they're going to protect bus passes, free university tuition, free prescriptions, the Scottish Child Payment. All quite nice things, I think is fair to say. Good to have.
Well, some of them, yeah. I think that we're seeing Scottish Labour struggling at the moment with what to do and what to say. I think probably frustrated, a little bit lost, unsure of how to get back to the point they were in 6 months ago, which was looking like they might actually be forming the Scottish Government, because at the moment they look like they're not going to. And I can understand why this is all happening internally, because, they are a bit bemused, I think, as to why this has happened. Having gone from thinking that Labour in government at Westminster would help them and propel them into government in Scotland, it actually looks like it's the opposite that's taking place. And so there's a bit of inconsistency. And we'll ask Anas and Jackie, obviously, about all this next week. I suppose the only thing I would say about it in general terms is that I still think that time for a change is probably time for a change is the most powerful message in politics, to be honest. It always has been. And I think when you've had a government in power for 20 years, and when the First Minister of that government has been one of the key leaders for that 20-year spell, you have to deploy the time for a change message. You have to. And Labour are deploying it. They're talking about a new direction and all that stuff. The difficulty is if you're saying, look at all these things we're going to keep, vote Labour for a new direction, there's a massive contradiction at the heart of that. And yes, some of the things you've listed are fine. Some of them are popular. Some of them are actually unsustainable and probably shouldn't take place in a more mature political environment. But the point is, you can't say everything's going to be exactly the same, vote for us, and at the same time have your slogan being a new direction for Scotland. It's just not consistent.
I'm looking at the tweet now from Scottish Labour. So the caption on it, Scottish Labour will protect the successes of devolution as we chart a new direction for our country. Then they list those 4 things. And then at the bottom is a new direction for Scotland. It's something of a hard sell, isn't it, Geoff?
Yeah, can I go back on Andy's something he said there? I mean, obviously Andy's dwelling on this huge experience of winning elections when he says that...
That's come early this week. We're 4 minutes in.
A time for change. I actually just want to, just for listeners' benefit, actually, in the run-up to 2007, for those of a certain vintage, you might remember that the SNP's campaign slogan was, "It's time." Now, we played around with change, but we did a lot of focus groups, and people were a bit concerned about putting the SNP in power because they didn't really know, they were an unknown quantity as a party of government at that point, obviously, because they'd never won an election before. And so we removed change and just said it's time for the SNP. And sometimes change can have negative connotations. And the problem for Anas Sarwar just now is that the change that they were offering a year ago, ahead of the general election, has turned out to be, in the views of some voters, not particularly appealing. So I'm not necessarily sure that you should say change alone. You have to say exactly what you're going to do. Now, that thing brings us to the strategy that Anas Sarwar is kind of adopting it here with this pledge to protect what is already there. And I think what he's trying to do, I'm trying to be fair to him here, he's trying to distinguish himself between his counterparts at Westminster. So we think about the winter fuel allowance cut, we think about the child payment gap, think about NIC rises, the National Insurance Contribution rises. And he's had to defend that. And what he's trying to do is put in the views of voters, actually, I'm not responsible for those things, but I will be responsible for these things. Now, does this strategy necessarily work? No, because if you're John Swinney, you'll just turn around and say, well, you just vote for the SNP and you'll continue to get them. You know, the ones that delivered most of these things. Not all of them, incidentally, because I know it was bus classes was there, and that was first introduced by the Labour Liberals. So I can see it as a strategy. I understand why he's doing it. And Andy's overriding analysis is right. I think this is Labour trying to find a niche in the marketplace for them ahead of 2026. I just don't know if it's going to be successful when you get into the cut and thrust of political debate.
Paul Hutchin, political editor at the Daily Record, reckons that bus passes, this is his tweet, they were first introduced by Labour and the Lib Dems, as you say, Geoff, that on tuition fees, that Labour and the Lib Dems scrapped tuition fees, but the SNP abolished a charge that paid for grants for students from low-income backgrounds.
It was called the endowment fee, if memory serves. So actually what Paul says is absolutely right.
Nice. And then he says 3 and 4, so that's free prescriptions and the Scottish Child Payment are both SNP policies. Andy, is it wise to talk about this from a Labour point of view when they're not offering anything different alongside it as yet? Would it not be better to say all at once, here's the stuff we're going to protect, obviously, and here's the stuff we're going to get brand new? They don't seem to have that locked down yet.
I suppose there are multiple answers to that. One is that this is obviously a subset of policies which are basically the universal giveaways. Now, there's a whole other argument about that and whether it's actually sensible long-term politics to be talking about these things anyway, which are most likely to be unaffordable, most or all of them in the longer term, will not be able to be carried out for all that long. So, I mean, I suppose that's a separate argument. You know, it does rather question whether or not we are getting into this immediate pre-election period where actually life is about how much you can promise for free. And, you know, let's get back to the point of pretending that the money just falls from the sky and these things can all be paid for. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, it may be a sort of race to the bottom on that. Fundamentally, though, I think that you invite two things when you say this. First of all, you invite a juxtaposition with the Labour government at Westminster because of what they are cutting as opposed to what Anas Sarwar says he's going to keep or give. And that juxtaposition is never going to work for Anas Sarwar. You know, I'm a broken record on this issue, but when your Westminster government takes decisions, that is what is in the minds of people when they go to polls in a Scottish Parliament election. It just is. There's really not a lot you can actually do about it. And I also do think that if you're going to talk about change, if your message is going to be change in a new direction, which I think is a fair message to give, you've got to be more optimistic, you've got to be more visionary, you've got to talk about bigger things than just state-funded universal giveaways. There are bigger things to talk about that are going wrong, and they need to move on to talking about that. I'm sure they will, but at the moment, I mean, I don't think that's a means for winning an election, what we've seen there.
Andy, I just think this great phrase that captures it. I've never heard it before. It's something like if your Westminster party sneezes, the Scottish party catches a cold, something like that. I think I'm going to use that in my output.
I'll tell you what, you've been listening.
I can't believe you didn't say it there. If I hear that second phrase one more time.
Despite the fact that in our former lives, Geoff, we would be telling our politicians to hammer home the message as many times as possible, the exact same one. I get a bit bored by the same messaging, to be honest, so I like to mix things up. But I'm glad that you're listening and reading, I must say. Well done.
Trust me, I'm not reading. I have to listen.
Hello to all the MSPs and special advisors who are listening today. You can have that one. Hello. I do just want to ask, just finally on this, before we get to questions from our listeners, Geoff, does this do anything to achieve distance from the UK Labour government? Go with me on this. I'm thinking specifically of the winter fuel payment, which the UK Labour government withdrew, and here's Scottish Labour saying, here's a bunch of free giveaways from the state that we're going to keep.
Yeah, well, that's as I said in my earlier answer. That's what this is an attempt to try and do. Distance yourself from what's gone down south from your colleagues there, and say, but we'll do this. So this is what I'm in charge of as Anas Sarwar, and we'll be in charge of if I'm First Minister. Just think it's a tough sell for the reasons that Andy's outlined, and for it's a simple kind of fodder for the SNP to say, well, you could just vote for us and continue them because we have maintained them. We can be trusted to do so. I think the key thing for Anas Sarwar is that he's going to do this fit as part of the platform that will protect that. It's then what else are you going to do to achieve this new direction that you want to achieve the country? So that's the most interesting bit. And that's what he's going to need to be pretty bold on, I would suspect. And only time will tell in terms of what that policy platform is.
Really interesting. Your thoughts on that, very welcome. You can email us, hello@holyroodsources.com, or you can WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 404 6507. Let's get on to lots of your questions and considerations as you've been listening to the podcast over the last few weeks. Thank you so much for these. We really do appreciate them. Some of them we use week by week. Some of them we gather up like this to use in a special episode like this one. Right, shall we start with this email from Dr. Oliver Thomas in Edinburgh? He says, hello, Holyrood Sources. On a recent podcast, Andy Maciver made a powerful argument for why increasing capacity is the key to tackling the crisis in our NHS. Superficially, it's an appealing line. We have fewer hospital beds relative to comparable nations. We have chronic understaffing across the sector. Employ more people, build more hospitals, we can do more good stuff. This argument is simple, easy, and wrong. It's like managing an overflowing bath by buying more buckets. You need to turn off the tap. It isn't capacity that's the problem, it's demand. And demand is a much more painful nettle to grasp. We turn off the tap by placing far greater focus on prevention to reduce the pressures on the capacity we already have, and we need to have real discussions about the things we fund and the things we prioritise. We make decisions about priorities, both actively and passively, but don't always include the people most affected by those decisions, nor do we communicate those decisions honestly and openly. The NHS can do so much, but it can't do it all. More capacity may be part of the solution, but it's not the silver bullet, says Dr. Thomas. Andy Maciver.
I don't disagree. Actually, he will be pleased. Dr. Thomas will be pleased to hear that he and I are in the same club. We can get jackets made and go out and talk about it. Listen, when the thing is, when you're answering questions on the NHS, which I do quite a lot, and writing about the NHS, you can't always get everything covered at the same time. I agree with them that it isn't just about capacity. I think we have a capacity issue. The stats are very, very clear and obvious on that, which is that for the amount of money we spend, we have a very poor return in terms of capacity, and I include in that beds, hospitals, scanners, nurses, doctors, and doctors in training, which are also very low compared to other countries. So, I stand by that. The capacity issue, even if the NHS did less, which I think it should, I think he's right about that, the capacity issue would probably still be there. But fundamentally, he is correct. The NHS that we created in 70-odd years ago, which fundamentally is the same model that we have right now, is the only unmodernised service in the country, really, did far less. It did much, much less back then than it does now. Expectations of it were less, and the amount that it tried to do was much less. And there is no question that there needs to be a conversation here about what the NHS does and what the NHS doesn't do, what the state is responsible for and what the state is not responsible for. So I agree with him completely. We don't disagree at all. I think he probably just heard my capacity bit and reasonably thought that I meant that we should increase capacity and still do the same stuff. I don't. I think we should increase capacity, but we should also do less at the same time.
Yeah, I'm not going to second guess the good doctor. He knows the stuff clearly, and actually it got me thinking when you were reading out that contribution that we do need to do a health special, but get clinical professionals on to tell us what the front line really looks like. I think two very quick observations. One, I think we need to be a healthier nation. And this isn't sexy for politicians because the preventative measures that you might put into making our country more active, for example, take one example, getting more sporting activity, more physical education, the benefits of that will not be felt for generations to come. But ultimately, I think that's something that we need to look at. I was a chairman of a sports charity which looked at how we can get greater participation in physical activity. I think that's got to be our focus. But I also mentioned in a recent podcast about my interactions with the NHS recently, and the doctor that said to me, that the front line in the NHS in Scotland is like a Formula One team. It's just being run like it's a quick fit. No disrespect to quick fit incidentally, because I got new tyres, by the way, last week from quick fit. And honestly, they did me a solid. I went at 8:30 and I was out there by 9. Brilliant, no appointment. Well done, quick fit Aberdeen. But the point he was making is that there was this bureaucracy above this that was hindering and being costly. And so I think there's two things. We need to work out what things the NHS shouldn't be doing. I think we all agree there is too many things they're doing. And secondly, what politician is going to take this by the scruff of the neck and say, we need to take a much more holistic, long-term view of preventative measures.
And the sad thing about the answer to that latter question is probably none.
Yeah.
Because a couple of the things that really, really need to be done are either politically toxic or they're boring. So the boring one is that we need to digitise the health service. The amount of money that is wasted in the health service, and obviously I know from my personal family experience here, the amount of money that is wasted in the health service because it is so outdated is extraordinary. I mean, it is eye-watering. This is a service that had, until recently, and possibly in some parts, still uses a fax machine, right? So this is what we're dealing with here. And so, that needs to be dealt with. And that's the unsexy thing. But the politically toxic thing, of course, is that people in this country need to take more care for their own health. We are an unhealthy nation, and a very great deal of it is down to the fact that people do not take responsibility for their own health because they know the NHS is sitting there to save them when they need it. Now, that's a awful argument for a politician to have to make. But it is the reality. And there's not many politicians who are actually prepared to stand up and do that, especially with a year to go before an election. So I ain't holding my breath on that one after.
Fair. Right, thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, and listen out for when we do our health special. You should come along. We'll be in touch. Right, Nick gets in touch to say, hello, another good episode. Well done. In his opening remarks, Alex Cole-Hamilton commented on the small size of Holyrood, meaning that we all get on when the cameras are off. Is the implication of this that performing for the media brings out the worst in the character of politicians? If so, what can stop them from behaving badly? Could they refuse to take part in the, quote, silly games and chasing sound bites? I know that our former spin doctors might have views on this, says Nick. Geoff, is there something of a performance to politics? I think it's almost inevitable, but does it go too far? It was an interesting comment from Alex Cole-Hamilton that it's actually a lot more collegiate when the cameras aren't pointing at people.
This is a really interesting point, and I can only offer my own experience. So when I was in government, invariably after First Minister's questions in the parliamentary day on a Thursday, that's the kind of end of the parliamentary week because MSPs are going back to their constituencies on Friday. You go along to the bar for a couple of drinks before you left, and we made a point of doing it. And I said to my staff, that the other advisors, try and do that as much as possible and have a blether, find out, take the temperature. And there was journalists, opposition politicians, and you actually got on really well, and you had a laugh. Same as any wider society, there's some people you're more aligned with, and there's some people that you don't. But it wasn't particularly political in that sense, And, I've heard kind of since then, and particularly since COVID, it's got a little bit scratchy, and I think there is something in the fact that behind the scenes people respect the fact that politicians are going through the same thing, whatever party or whatever views that they hold. They all get the same criticisms from constituents or indeed from the press and all the rest of it. So there is a mutual respect there. But I do think our tone of debate in the last years generally has got a little bit OTT at times. We've lost a little bit of fun in some of the debate as well. I'm not saying it should be fun. They're there to work, but I've been quite a lot sometimes, and Alex Salmond's First Minister, he would always want to win a debate and then stamp on your throat, but he had a bit of a comedic streak to what he did as well, and he was always willing to chat to folk thereafter. So maybe there is maybe a bit of a tone we could strike. I just don't see it likely ahead of 2020.
Yeah, well, that's the other point. You're absolutely right to make it, that with a year to go to the election, where politicians want to show difference and want to point out why you should vote for me and not that guy over there, that actually there's an argument to suggest this could get worse as far as Nick might be concerned. Andy, what do you think on this?
I think there's two things. In terms of how things are behind closed doors with politicians, there has been a change since the referendum, and particularly the Parliament between 2016 and 2021 was a very difficult, pretty toxic Parliament, partly because of Brexit, partly because of independence, partly because of the COVID stuff. And it became very difficult towards the end of that Parliament. Actually, that's part of the reason why the Green Coalition deal ever happened, but that's a separate episode, I suppose. There's no question that politicians have worked well together in the past, and behind closed doors there is a lot more friendliness than people would think that there is. But as I say, that friendliness has gone downhill somewhat in the sort of second half of devolution compared to the first. I think there's a chance, depending on the outcome of the next election, that might reinvigorate a little bit, and it might get a little bit more friendly and collegiate inside the building. The other part of the question was about performance and media and so on. I think that's a much more difficult issue. It's also not just a Scottish issue, it's a UK-wide issue. So politicians in front of microphones and cameras and in public behave in an entirely different way to any other profession you could ever come across. So, Calum, you listen to Your Times Radio breakfast show, you got 4 hours of it every morning. Politicians do interviews in an entirely different way to anybody else who you ever have on the show.
Yeah.
So they don't answer questions, or they answer questions with answers that are answers to questions that weren't asked, right? This is how they do it. And the reason they do that is because people like me in my past life trained them to not answer questions. And it's this vicious cycle whereby journalists, and particularly broadcast journalists, present company accepted, of course, will ask questions in a way that attempts to trip politicians up, that attempts to basically back them into an answer they know they can't really give, because they think it creates a better headline for, the news hour that's coming up 10 minutes later, maybe even makes it beyond that into other media and into other press. And at the same time, politicians say, well, I'm just not going to, I'm not going to play that game, so I'm going to refuse to answer that question, or I'm going to come on and give my message that my press officer has told me to give, irrespective of what question I'm asked. This is not going anywhere, right? This cycle is just useless. It's a waste of time. Listeners don't like it, therefore voters don't like it, the media don't like it, and politicians don't like it. Part of the reason, of course, that we started this podcast is because we wanted to have a different sort of conversation with politicians in the first place. And I think, that is doable, albeit with a longer format, and it's easier there than it is in other formats. Somebody's got to make the first move here. I think it should be politicians, personally, before the media. I think politicians should simply say, okay, I'm just going to answer your questions, okay? You do with that answer what you like. You misrepresent it, you fire it out to lots of other media, try and get a big storm about it, fine. But I'm going to answer that question honestly, and then let's just see how that sort of conversation goes. Again, much like the answer I gave on the NHS earlier on, I don't see who's going to decide there's a first mover advantage in doing that. So I'm not entirely convinced that the massive juxtaposition between politicians in public and politicians in private is going to change too soon either.
It's interesting on this. I was speaking to friends that work in media, primarily in London, last night, and they were talking about how some politicians seem to be actually quite scared of the kind of long-form interview, which has become perhaps more of a thing in American political coverage than it has done here. And I was kind of thinking, well, actually, credit to the politicians that come on this podcast and sit with us for an hour and a half, and have conversations about stuff. And actually, that shouldn't go unnoticed, that perhaps Scottish politicians do step up and into that format more than you might think of Westminster politicians, if I can put it like that. It was just a notable difference, I thought, when I was speaking to my friends last night. There you go. Thank you, Nick. Right, shall we get on to some of your voice notes? You can send these on WhatsApp, of course. We always love to get them. Here is the first one from David.
Hi, guys. Thanks again for the podcast. As always, it's been incredibly stimulating, if at times frustrating. where you said that people were scunnered with Labour and the Tories, and that this was a great opportunity for the SNP. But you've got to factor in that people are scunnered with the SNP. So I, for example, voted for independence in 2014 and campaigned for it. I certainly wouldn't do the same just now. I'd probably vote against, if not abstain, because I think that the SNP are not serious. I think that they've become the EU NP, the EU party, if you like. They want us to go into a bigger union. I, like a third of Scots SNP supporters, voted for Brexit. The other thing is, I don't really believe that the SNP leadership want a referendum. They know that they would lose it. I think that they keep offering this because they want to keep the troops on board, and they're like the Grand Old Duke of York. I think this has been the case since 2018. They march them up to the top of the hill and they march them down again. And it's always jammed tomorrow.
That from David. Geoff, should we come to you first on this? The scunner Sorry. The scunner factor with the SNP, they're not serious. They're the EU National Party. Wouldn't win a referendum.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah,
I won't go through every single issue. But I would resist what he says on the scunner factor. I think I've been pretty open that I don't think the electorate right now are thinking, yay, I can go and vote for the SNP again at the next election. I don't think that's the sentiment at all. I think that they're benefiting from the fact we've seen a pretty insipid start from the UK Labour government, and Anas Sarwar struggling to defend that. I think we've seen the rise of Reform, which is acting as a unionist party poison pill, because it's taking votes largely from the Tories and Labour, and it's keeping the SNP vote pretty stagnant, and that would be enough to see them win. So I accept the premise on that. In fairness to the SNP, I think, John and Kate are putting forward a much more pragmatic policy platform. They seem to be focusing a little bit more on core issues. And fundamentally, the only chance you're going to get a referendum, come to that point in a second, is if you've got a pro-independence majority. But on that very point, I don't think it's right to say that they don't want a referendum. I think it's right to say they can't get a referendum because it's the UK government's, consecutively said, get it. And because of the Supreme Court judgment, they feel that they're under no obligation to do so. The only way that might happen is if there is a pro-independence majority passed at the following election. However, all eyes on Mr. Swinney himself to see what his strategy is for that ahead of the election. I suppose very briefly on the EU point. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, and people don't actually talk about this a lot, that there was a sizable cabal of supporters for the SNP that were anti-EU, that voted for Brexit. But if I'm giving my honest strategic opinion and advice, and yes, I wouldn't have voted for Brexit myself, I don't think there's many people around the country, even amongst many Brexit voters, saying what a roaring success that has been. So, there is a potential route there for the SNP to put that forward as part of their independence plans after the election.
Yeah. Andy?
I mean, I think it was a really interesting voice note, because I tell you what it does is it makes it clear that not everybody fits into a neat box in the way the political bubble likes to think. Okay? So,
point.
Inside the bubble, that sort of view is very odd and isn't able to be computed, really. And even pollsters find it hard to find people like that, to be honest with you, who have these really nuanced views. But those are voters. I think we have to, it's really important to remember that voting is quite a self-interested act. People vote for what is going to make them better off, ultimately. That's what happens. And because of that, people can change their votes very, very quickly. Most people, and most of the people who swing elections and who swing referendums, they're not members of political parties. They don't follow a particular tribe. They don't particularly identify with any party in general, or any nation in general, really. They don't tend to be either British or Scottish nationalists either. They're just kind of Midland people who vote for what they think is going to be the best option at the time. They did that last July, and a lot of them look like they're going to change because they might go back and vote for John Swinney this time instead. So, I mean, I think that's an important understanding, is that people like our listeners, they operate in grey worlds. They don't operate in black and white worlds, and that's why. I do think, though, that most people, I'll put it this way, there'll be more people who were very upset with the SNP who are now more optimistic towards them and a little bit and going a little bit easier on them than the number of people who were positive about the SNP and are now negative about them. So I mean, I think that is reflected in overall polling, and that's why John Swinney and Kate Forbes are basically doing pretty well at the moment and getting more people on board. But I do think that it's a warning to all parties that not everybody can be put in that box, and that's what makes elections unpredictable, because normal people don't operate in bubbles like we do.
Yeah, totally fair. Right, I just want to play this voice note next from Donald, which is also particularly interesting and focuses on the SNP.
I just watched your latest podcast, the Nicola Sturgeon's Legacy is Undone, No Lib Dem Coalition one. Excellent content again for everyone. Thank you very much. I'm really enjoying this. I'm just a recent signer-upper. I think that the issue SNP, as a former SNP member, I just left because I'm scunnered and they didn't listen, was a lot of the MSPs are high on values, what they perceive to be values anyway, but extremely poor on practical understanding about how to implement what they want. So they naturally go to civil servants and say, my inbox is full of issues such as housing. What do I do? And those ultra-centralised civil service people in Victoria Quay come up with a national solution, a one-size-fits-all, because that's the easiest, because it protects the status quo. Whereas delivering land reform, which is really what we need, is a much, much more challenging reality that can't be delivered easily without taking on the establishment, particularly landowner, Duke of Westminster and all these sort of people. So really, really tough, that one. The SNPs run away from it. They don't realise they've run away from it because all they've done is their actions is to set up a talking shop of consultation after consultation.
Thank you, Donald. Right, who wants to come in first on this? Geoff?
I mean, Andy Maciver, he's very passionate in land reform, as am I, but he's very articulate on it. But I thought there was a point in his contribution there that really chimed with me, and it's when he said they're trying to find national policies to very kind of sometimes niche or localized issues that don't perhaps comprehend the full sophistication of what's at stake. And I was casting my mind back, God, about 18 months ago when Hamza Yusuf was First Minister. And at that time, and it wasn't his policies, I mean, he'd inherited them. Do you remember that there was essential policy of planning wood-burning stoves?
Yeah.
And that just fits into that category. Of course we should do that because it's much better for the climate and all the rest of it. Yes, but our rural communities, actually some of them largely require that to keep their bloody homes, in winter. And we had similar and highly protected marine areas, the coastal communities were up in arms about it. But a policy engineered in Edinburgh just didn't seem to consider the full views and spectrum of opinion. And we even have juryless trials, even though the largest legal fraternity, all the large swathes of legal fraternity were totally opposed to it. And I think there's something in this, when you're just coming up with policy, with all the best intentions, I do think you have to consider localities, you have to consider different sections of society and consult accordingly. And I don't think that was ever done in those issues, because if it was, clearly the responses would be what they ultimately were and why those policies went into abeyance or cancellation. So I think the point he makes is very, very good in that respect.
I think he's identified a massive problem, to be honest. It doesn't get spoken about too much, but the civil service, without question, is a problem for any government that wants to get things done and get things done quickly. And I think all we've heard from John Swinney and Kate Forbes, and listeners can decide whether or not they take this at face value or not, but that's not really the point. all we've heard from John Swinney and Kate Forbes is that they want to turn words into action. That's what John Swinney said when he came in. It's an action-led government. He wants to get things done. The difficulty is the civil service wants to turn action into words. The civil service has never seen a consultation it doesn't like, especially a long-term one. Okay? And this is this is genuinely a real problem for the government, because in areas, so we talked about the NHS earlier on in the podcast. In the NHS, if you want to make major reform and major change, you have your principal opponent is the civil service. And it's very, very difficult to get things done in the rapid and often in the quite radical way that somebody like, say, Kate Forbes might want to do it without simply having the civil service blocking you every step of the way. So I think that we will, this will maybe come out over future years as we look at what's been achieved and what's not been achieved. But it's a pretty big red flag for politicians in terms of whether or not they're actually going to be able to make major change and take major action in areas that are significantly deficient and need a lot of work. The civil service are not always... Now, this is not a blanket thing, right? There are very good, high-quality people in the civil service who understand issues and understand policy and understand how to make things happen. But as an institution, it is slow and it is cumbersome and it is often blocking. And I think that's something which is a major problem if you want to achieve anything.
I just if I may come in on that, because obviously I worked in government for 7 years, and I came across many very talented civil servants. Indeed, it's about leadership, and what you want to do and try and achieve is have your elected cabinet secretaries and ministerial team with a clear policy direction, and then you direct the civil service. Now, the civil service job is to say, yes, Minister, that's possible within the parameters of what our capabilities are. I think the challenge is ensuring that your cabinet and your ministerial team are empowered to be clear with their civil servants that that's what the direction of travel is. And I don't accept, Andy, that the civil service are the biggest opposition. They can be if there isn't the leadership, the political leadership in place to direct them. And so it can be a hurdle, but it can also be a great opportunity. It's a huge resource. And I would question whether at times it has been used to its fullest capability.
Good. Okay. Let's go on. I probably should have read this one earlier. Apologies, that's my mistake. But it's just an interesting insight from Fraser, who says, on national treatment centres, which we mentioned on our episode just towards the end of January, Fraser says, I currently work in one of the 4 that are operating. Highland is my one, Fife, Forth Valley, and the extension of the Golden Jubilee. We have incredible cross-board regional working with the North of Scotland Board, and we're delivering for patients from Auchterarder to Orkney and the Western Isles. It protects elective capacity and has taken some elective operating out of acute settings like Rigmore Hospital in Inverness. The key thing where I wholeheartedly disagree with Andy on is that the NTC network isn't a game changer. It's improved waiting times for patients and improved patient experiences. However, he is right about not enough capacity generally, so I'm not totally disagreeing. Geoff's point about bureaucracy is correct. It isn't just the NHS, it's among the political classes too. These centres need capital budgets to be built because it expands capacity and delivers better patient care. It allows those clinicians who are like F1 teams to deliver in an F1 environment. There also needs to be heavy IT investment to get away from a network of myriad systems that don't talk to each other to a small number of systems which work together and would make administrative life far easier. We work with technology that was out of date by the mid-2000s, says Fraser. I think Can we just agree that we're going to do this health special and get some 100%.
Clearly, because clearly it is an issue of huge interest. And it's on us. We're not the experts here. We need to get the right folk in the room because, everywhere I go in the country, people raise different issues relating to health provision. And I think we need to do something pretty big on this.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I'm in.
I don't have a fantastic memory. And I also, I talk a lot, right? But I don't think I did say the NTC. I don't think I said the NTC network was a game changer. To be honest with you, maybe somebody else did. I'm pretty sure it wasn't me. But Fraser, please do send us a note if I did and tell me where I said it, and fine. I don't think it is, incidentally. There's no such thing as a game changer within the current structure of the NHS. This is about managed decline. That's what this is. And unless we change the system, there's no game changer.
Fair. It was on our episode on the 29th of January, and we were talking about John Swinney's promises on the NHS in that context, and whether these things that were actually promised in 2016, whether they were actually coming to fruition or not, these national treatment centres. Right, a couple of quick ones as well. This one's from Tim, one for Geoff Aberdein. Why do you keep calling Aberdeen the European capital of oil and gas? Having worked in Norway for years, I think he's wrong. It's am I going to pronounce this correctly? It's Stavanger.
Stavanger.
Where the new Shell platform for Rosebank has just been built, says Tim. Geoff, your right of reply starts now.
I have to say, it wasn't me that coined the phrase oil and gas capital of Europe. It predates me somewhat, I have to say. But what I can tell our listener is, the northeast of Scotland has the largest concentration of energy supply chain companies anywhere in the UK. There is very little that has been built in oil and gas in the last 50 years in terms of high-value manufacturing that hasn't had some sort of Aberdeen interest in it or involvement in it. If you can do it in the North Sea, you can do it anywhere. Don't disagree that Stavanger is also a massive hub for energy. I think the focus now is how do we transition to ensure that Aberdeen, whatever people may call it now, is called, the green energy capital of Europe in the future. That's got to be the focus while sustaining the very supply chain through oil and gas in the meantime until renewables are available commercially at scale.
And Andy, final one for you. This is from Fraser. Hi guys, quick question. Andy recently said that Anas Sarwar hasn't done anything particularly wrong in the face of a collapse in support for a Scottish Labour government. However, shouldn't the point be that he hasn't done anything particularly impressive either? What is Sarwar offering that will deliver practical improvements to people's lives, and in which areas has he distanced himself from an already unpopular UK government? This probably goes over something of what we discussed at the start of the pod, but that came in from Fraser, so I wanted to voice it on his behalf.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair enough. I mean, but the answer is nothing yet. I think that the one thing that Anas Sarwar has said from time to time, and I think he needs to do more of, is to talk about how he's going to move power out of Holyrood and to closer to people. He needs to turn that into something which has a sort of electability about it and which is a bit more attractive electorally. But essentially, his talk about giving local authorities more power, creating mayoralties, is actually all very good stuff in a country where power has been significantly centralised in Edinburgh to the detriment of areas further away from Edinburgh. So that actually is something, well, firstly, it's a decent USP, because I don't expect that the SNP will say anything like that. So it's a reasonable USP, and it is something that actually could significantly change things on the ground for people. It could change lives, decentralisation. So that's something that he can say. But no, I mean, he's right. That our listener is correct. He has not said much yet in the positive side of the balance sheet, but he does have a year to go.
Yeah, he does have a year to go. And he's got a week to go till he'll be on this podcast. Anas Sarwar and Jackie Bailey in conversation. You will hear that next week. If you've got questions you want us to put to them, you can email them to hello@holyroodsources.com between now and then. Make sure you join us for that. Geoff and Andy, thank you both. Thanks very much indeed. If you'd like to get comments in, questions in, and voice notes, we love getting your voice notes. If you'd like to get them in on WhatsApp, then please do. The number is 0333 404 6507. And we will talk to you next week with the leader and deputy leader of the Scottish Labour Party. Speak to you then.